Welcome to the COVID-19 Assemblages, Queer and Feminist Perspectives from South Asia, which is a panel discussion organized as part of the ESRC Festival of Social Science and partnered with University of Sussex. Rohit, Paul, and I are here today with a diverse panel from across or working on South Asia. We are here through and against the background of a wide range of vulnerabilities and marginalizations that have been sharpened via the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, since the making of the pandemic, an array of individuals, social groups, collectives, within their own contexts and across contexts, have been diligently documenting and analyzing the increasing inequalities, sharing stories of death and survival, and intervening with mostly very limited resources. Our panel is one amongst many such attempts to comprehend and share this moment through an intersecting queer and feminist lens. Some of us believe that this act of documentation and sharing is the need of the hour, not only to intervene in the short term, but also to register the moment as witnesses and survivors and join attempts to create alternative discourses and histories of the present. How do practices of living and surviving for queer and trans star persons across caste, race, class, disabilities, regions get interrupted and violently erased during a pandemic? How do queer and trans star persons across caste, race, class, disabilities, regions endure and attempt to reconfigure their lives through such erasures? More importantly, who among them is able to live and who decides to starve and eventually die? And equally important, what can an intersecting queer and feminist lens learn from such lives and deaths that are being documented, enumerated, and incarcerated through the pandemic? These are a few of the many questions that inform our discussion today. Our panelists are also contributors to our edited collection titled COVID-19 Assemblages, Queer and Feminist Ethnographies from South Asia, which is going to be published in 2021 as part of our Routledge book series, Ethnographic Innovation, South Asian Perspectives. There are, of course, many contributors here, to the book more than there are here. Our discussion today, our edited volume, and our series are intertwined with a continuing and abiding need to A, connect across intellectual, emotional, social, and geopolitical differences, B, produce relevant knowledges about the social that gets discussed and critiqued after journalists have left the scene, and C, intently listen without necessarily being listened to. After our introductory comments, there will be 2 rounds of discussion. In the first round, we will ask each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and speak about their contributions for the volume in 6 to 7 minutes. In the second round, we will ask specific questions to each of our panelists, which they will have 5 minutes to address. At the very end, we will have about 15 minutes for questions and answers from those who are listening in. Thank you again to all of you for being here, and a special thanks to Lorna Hards and Medini Fordham from the University of Sussex for helping us to put together this event. And now over to Rohit.
Thank you very much, Niharika, for those introductory remarks, and also a big thank you to our fantastic speakers who are all here today to speak to towards this important issue. I think there's something to note over here is that our speakers are not just academics, but they are also community organizers, they're also activists. And I think that voice is very, very important given the time that we are living in. So this panel comes out of a very particular moment in time with the COVID-19 pandemic, which, as we know, is threatening lives, global economy and well-being in a way that no other contemporary crisis has done before. And whilst, in the West it's being described as this great leveler, we are acutely aware that the virus has particularly disproportionate impact on ethnic minority populations, on working class communities, sexual and gender minorities, and those who are immunocompromised. So policies, such as social distancing as a means to mitigate the crisis has had very little impact on densely populated regions such as South Asian cities, and are further deepening vertical hierarchies between social groups. In addition, as we have seen, people living in slums and migrants from rural areas have limited access to water and toilet and being able to practice the hygiene that is recommended to prevent contagion. Many in the region have been forced to travel long distances to return home, and these journeys engendering more precarity and death in some cases than the virus itself. We are living through a very epoch-making moment, which is threatening our social order and our way of life with devastating impact, especially on working class communities in South Asia. People who are living in the West, which allows working from home, furloughing, are sadly missing in South Asia, where the majority of the people are working in agricultural, manufacturing, service sectors, which have been left stranded and without the benefit of a welfare state. And it is also worth remembering that around 90% of South Asians' population work in the informal sector, making it impossible for some to access government support. Low-income countries such as India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, who account for manufacturing most of the goods that is sold in the global north, have seen their orders cancelled. In the Bangladesh garment industry alone, we saw orders of over 1.4 billion cancelled, leading to millions of workers losing their livelihood in a very split moment. So against this background, the crisis has also created a very unprecedented situation, which has seen many LGBTQ people isolated without any support structures. Gender and sexual minorities in the region who we've spoken to in the last few months have told us about their dread of having to move away from their families of choice, sometimes back into hostile situations, or they're being forced into social isolation. As research has shown, LGBTQ people are also significantly more susceptible to mental health issues due to discrimination and inequalities, which is exacerbated through social isolation. So beyond kind of the obvious issues around income, around housing, food, LGBTQ people are also having to move back into unsafe spaces, go back into the closet, or having to remain silent. So how do we as queer and feminist scholars and activists witness, document, and understand this? And it is really important to go beyond the arguments of the economic and health impact of COVID and to think of intersectional issues as Niharika mentioned, about social justice, about the oppression wreaked by COVID-19. And we feel that the queer and feminist voices today and also in the book, offers those critical strategies to strengthen our collective organizing across all identity and positionality lines, and holds the promise for consolidating power against common oppressors who have incredibly disproportionate power. So with those opening remarks, I'll pass on to Paul.
Hi. So I'm just going to add some opening reflections which connect some other themes of the book and the wider project to social scientific perspectives. So I want to say something about social sciences, COVID-19 and queer and feminist perspectives today. And one of the things is we see these as sites of intersection and boundary making, axes around which information and viral exchanges are taking place, alongside fissures where critical conversations also appear to be precluded. So one of the salient features of the present epidemic has been the entry of data into the public sphere, most of it epidemiological and demographic in nature. We might be familiar with seeing lots of graphs and so on and so forth in the media. Yet this kind of data only tells us a part of the story. What we know from prior epidemics is that we often had to force other kinds of knowledge into the narrative. So one of the things I'm thinking of here is of the HIV and AIDS epidemic, which until the current pandemic had been the largest global epidemic in living memory. Those of us who worked as researchers and activists in the context of HIV and AIDS learned very quickly that we had to both resist and work with global health scientists and epidemiologists in a spirit of collaboration and skepticism, attentive to epidemiological and methodological divides and connections. This entailed working with and querying data sets and normative knowledge regimes, which anyway always seem to tell quite queer, unclear and skewed stories about the nature of HIV and AIDS. Now, South Asia is one of the global regions wherein data divides about that prior epidemic were most resisted and theorized. Activism among sex workers, people of transgender experience, men who have sex with men and drug users forced other kinds of reckonings, compelling experiential knowledge of sexual and other risks into the public sphere, where often, certainly in the early days of the epidemic, they were very much denied. This does not always happen equally across class, caste, ethnic and religious rifts, and not without ongoing struggle, but to effect nonetheless. And I think many of the community formations that are represented here today emerged at that time. So the legacies of the kind of queer activism around COVID-19 emerged through the response to HIV and AIDS. So in the present moment, much of that prior experiential, gendered and sexual knowledge seems to be under erasure again. There seems to be some ways in which that prior understanding, that collective experience of facing an epidemic, which queer and feminist activists developed together, seems to be somewhat under erasure again. There is a lack of public domain data about how women and gender and sexual minorities have been especially affected by the epidemic in very particular ways in South Asia and globally. So recent UN reports have called for more analysis of this kind, and we're responding to that call here. So the present meeting and the book on which it is based seeks to intervene into the scene of silencing. Our aim is to open a space in which queer and feminist perspectives on COVID-19 might find expression. Now, in some ways, this is about allowing space for minoritized voices, but it's more than that too. Queer and feminist experiences also tell us something about how otherwise normative knowledge of an epidemic is assembled and made prevalent, how it is synthesized and legitimized. Questions arise as to what and whose knowledge makes it into the public sphere and why, and what and who seems lost and why. So against the background of that reflection, in this project, we draw on Deleuze and Guattari's assemblage theory as a framing for our project. This calls attention to constellations as means of thinking about terrains of information making and embodiment, noting that what counts as information in one part of a system may be overlooked or not admitted elsewhere, this being bound up with norms in power, regimes and epistemologies. We want to admit queer and feminist perspectives from South Asia into our discussion to see what understandings of COVID-19 might surface across our collective experiencing. In doing so, we seek to open a novel space for regional, social scientific and experiential perspectives to frame new dialogues. We see this arising across diverse points across a territory, and this encompasses South Asia as a geopolitical region, but in turn it also encompasses contemporary experiences of COVID-19 as they're bound up with terrains and histories of difference, connecting and resistance. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Rohit and Paul. You know, we are going to open with Shanta. If you can, you know, briefly introduce yourself and also read your poem, we'll be very happy.
So my name is Santa Kurai and I'm from Manipur. I identified myself as an Manipuri indigenous Nupi Manbi, which can be translated as transgender women in English. So I have been working in the transgender rights for the past 15, 20 years. Recently, I got a message from Paul, and Paul had invited me to submit a poem for a book, and I was very happy. And immediately I just opened my laptop and writing a short poem. The poem is about how this pandemic has, completely devastated the human, the in the in to all the humans, irrespective of gender, caste, color, race, everything. It did not have any bias to anybody. It just comes and then it spread throughout throughout the globe. So the name of my poem is Looming. An indifferent life filled with diversified changes. Some arrived in the form of man-made regulations, and some with stricken pens, the oppression of the majoritarianism, the voice that once seems cacophonous, like the harsh cow under the unsavory summer sun, with the slogan inherited, my rights, my identity, has manifested to loud chirping of a cricket in a silent night, a loud enough voice to disturb the non-violent night. In the journey of survival of the standard life, arrived one vigorous and powerful force, given an intense span in depth. The new arrival, they, they did not differentiate human, rich, poor, races, languages, geographies, gender, sex. They came riding the speedy chariot of winds and landed on human civilization with pell-mell pace, proliferate, proliferated and invaded the globe with their offspring. To this world, they identified for rich, majority, minority, sex, gender, through power and resources. It is a new war bringing a fresh layout. In the war, the warrior loved like thunder, sing the suffering of the people in the margin, the euphoric to the testimony of human race, who confined in the fear of the war, like living like pupa in a cocoon. The illuminated chapter of human intelligence are blackened with soot. The ferocious war carried brutish forces. The war drained the human knowledge to defense, pushed the people in the margin to an unprepared, disastrous environment, living as grass that suffer when two bulls fight, strengthen the looming sense of losing everything. Thank you. This is the poem which I have written recently. Mm,
Thank
yeah.
you, Shanta.
Mm.
So I'm going to next ask Vara if you would like to make your opening remarks.
My name is Varadas Tyagaraja. I am originally from Sri Lanka, but currently now based in the UK, but working on a PhD on queer politics in Sri Lanka. Let me start with two examples, right? So I was planning to go back home during last April 2019, and I went to London to spend a couple of days with my friends before I head on to the airport, in which I get caught during the lockdown and then decided to stay back and postpone my journey. And then it was sort of a time that the pandemic started to spread back home as well. That's when sort of I got the call somewhere around this time to write this chapter for this edited volume. Now it was also a time that me trying to put things together and trying to keep things documented and trying to do some relief work back home. I have two stories. First one is about the lockdown debate back home. So when sort of the dominant form of managing the pandemic became lockdown in many countries, Sri Lanka was also trying to initiate lockdown. And I saw a two friends of mine who maintains a Facebook page posted on their wall saying that lockdown now or never, sort of a campaign, lockdown Sri Lanka now or never, sort of a campaign that was trying to force the president to lock down the whole country so that we can try to contain the escalation of the situation. Immediately after that post, another friend of mine commented sort of saying, let me read it out, just a second. Here we go. Right. The comment was this: what about the Sri Lankans that cannot go a month without work or medication? Thankfully, some of us have the privilege, most don't. Be thoughtful. Don't lock down Sri Lanka, but yet take more precautions to limit even contact more. This was sort of the post of lockdown now or never, and the comment problematizing the call for lockdown. It's a quite powerful manifestation of the two debates, the dominant debate and the dissenting or the counter debate about the lockdown that were taking place within the queer community in Sri Lanka. So the post was also from two queer women, and the comment was also from a person who identifies as non-conforming or non-binary queer person. Now, this debate was basically about, so who wants lockdown and who's lockdown, who gets to decide what, the lockdown should be imposed or not. And the sort of revelation is that, the one who has the ability to afford a lockdown, staying in a place where they would call as home or consider as home, and continue to have their access to medications, particularly people who live with HIV and other issues within the queer community. And the other ones that were really concerned about an indiscriminate lockdown was basically the ones who cannot go another day without any form of work to feed their loved ones or themselves, and those who do not have a place that they would call as home to be safe during lockdown. And whether we like it or not, the dissenting voice about lockdown wasn't very powerful. As often the lockdown is, back home was dominated by mostly liberal-looking lobby, and lobby that is more in line with militaristic or nationalistic form of interventions into the lockdown. So that's one example that I thought of very illuminative about the debates that took place within the queer community about lockdown, which also brought into factors like class and then your social status and health conditions and things together into the debate. The second example was about Pride. So this was the time where everybody was sort of celebrating virtual Pride, shifting from physical space to virtual space as a way of resilience, as a sign of resilience within the queer community. The Pride commemorations and related activities. And I got a call on Monday, somewhere around June, from a fellow activist back home in Sri Lanka, saying that, Vara, what's the plan for Pride? Should we do something? And then we were talking about, Pride obviously involves investing a lot of resources and energies and then commitments to bring an output. Then the idea was, what's the need of the hour? The question of what is needed, what's the most immediate form of resilience? What is the most efficient form of response in a time of pandemic like this, where the worst, the most precarious part of the Sojise community is being, queer community is being completely sidelined and made further vulnerable, things like that. Then there were a few organizations we were talking to and having a chat, and then we had a situation where one of our community members went into one of these organizations and asking for some kind of help because they couldn't pay the rent and the landlord was trying to kick them out. And the simple reply was, we don't have committed funds to help you. And then it turned out to be reverse situation. And same organization that did not have resources to support with community, queer community with their immediate needs. It's just food. It's just a place to, a shelter to stay, or a place to, stay safe, and then to buy their medications. The same organization, a few weeks later, seems to be investing quite a lot on virtual pride, and then the matter came into a question: whose virtual pride is this? Is this a matter of resilience, or is it a matter of resilience of a selected group of people? But this issue never got into the public debate questioning virtual pride, because even the worst affected one, who are in need of basic needs and who understand this, the privileged positions of having virtual pride, did not question the matter in public, because there were no choice left them to, bring those voices out. A, because the channels of communications and channels of voices were not dominated by them. B, they have been in a lockdown within these four walls for so long, and there were desperate situations looking for interactions and communications. So when you bring in virtual pride, inviting people to come and talk, that was also considered to be better than nothing kind of a situation. So these are two examples that I thought as opening remarks for my entry from Sri Lanka, which would question, some of these conceptual and queer and feminist intersectional interventions. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
And thanks, Wara. I think you've made some excellent points about how the stories you mentioned, how they're kind of countering some of the broader mainstream narratives. And I really like the point you've made about resilience of a selected group. And I hope hopefully we'll pick these up in the question and answer round. So thank you very much for that. I next want to call on Adnan Hussain. Adnan, if you want to introduce yourself and also make your opening remarks. Adnan.
I'm just very excited to be a part of this assemblage. So I am based in the Netherlands as an interdisciplinary, I consider myself as an interdisciplinary social scientist. And I see I see the divide between activism and academic work to be a false one, to be honest. So I believe that good theories are always useful for activists, and good activism always good for academic writings like this, good academic theorization. So that's my approach. So that's why I'm particularly interested in this project that attempts to kind of bridge that gap, which may at times seem like unbridgeable. So I've been thinking about the impact of the COVID-19 on LGBTI groups, because I've been working with the LGBTI groups in Bangladesh for a very long time, actually since 2000, from the days I was an undergraduate student. And I've been involved also in sexual rights organizing. So, I've been doing both, and I'm still involved with a lot of community-based organizations in Bangladesh. So I actively, work with them, and in different capacities. But I also sort of, research a range of issues to do with sexual diversity, gender, also, particularly masculinities, more recently heterosexualities, of course, and intersex studies, also very recently in the context of Bangladesh, but also race and ethnic relations. So these are the issues that I work on, like broad range of interest, but and I'm actually now involved in a small research project that I'm doing along with a few other colleagues who are based in Bangladesh, not just as academics, but also as activists, and they're from the trans community. And it's about basically exactly the topic that we're investigating, right? But it's more about the experiences of, these different kinds of violence in the wake of COVID-19 and, housing crisis, like many were evicted, like livelihood related issues. So broadly, and it's a research that is still in progress. So I've been able to draw from that research partially, to write the piece. Thankfully, it was very short. It didn't have to be very long. Then I would have been in trouble because I didn't feel that I had a lot to say. So yeah, I'm very happy to be here and to be learning from all of you. So maybe I will share more when in the second round, when there will be some more time for me to perhaps engage, on a content level, like, more on a thematic level. So thank you. Really excited and grateful, for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Adnan, for that. And you're absolutely, we are in resonance with you, where the bridge between academia and activism is something that many of us are trying to, move between. And we'll talk more about that, absolutely. Next, can I call upon Raji? After Raji, can I call upon Ruxana? Both Raji and Ruxana are from Nepal. If I can also, along with your introduction, ask you, a question about what does, for you in Nepal, what does doing queer feminist activism mean during a pandemic?
Yeah, it was really great to come together to be part of this writing initiative. Our Queer Rights Collective, where we sort of connected, we do different kinds of work, and we connected trying to envision, alternative narratives, when a lot of the narratives in Nepal are very homonormative and guided by the government and often international organizations with their own agendas. And this sort of boxing of, male, female, and then everyone else's third gender, which Ruxana will also talk upon as one of our works that we've been trying to put together in Nepal to make visible. So as we were coming together to see like, oh, what should we sort of write about, our idea sort of went into why not do sort of an archiving conversations about what the last 2 years for us has been about, and especially in the context of COVID as it was unfolding. September now seems like such a far away like time, because right now it's really dire situation in Kathmandu. October for my family was, I just tested negative last week. And it's just really scary times for people here in Kathmandu. It's spreading really, really quickly. So as we were having those conversations in September, one of our focus was to look at how we were sort of providing care for one another, and the things that we were doing within QRC from the time we sort of connected. And one of the things that really stood out to us was all the internal work that was happening. You know, we started doing a lot of online work, and as COVID was happening, and even before that, the year before, we had done some events. But then there was a lot of behind work, like through online chat group that we have of all the members, that has been very key for us to give each other support, because even though we would meet in Kathmandu, you know, most of the conversation and getting support from each other, asking for help, happened online already. So we realized that as COVID was unfolding, we sort of knew where everyone was and what kind of help potentially people in the collective might need. And when I say collective, that's 12 of us. So that we felt was a strong space to be in. Just knowing that, okay, if need be, we will be there, you know. And still, I mean, it's such everything is so unknown, you know, it's still unfolding. We're still in the middle of it. I think we won't know the full extent of what is going to happen, you know, for a while. So with that intention, we put together a conversation on Skype. And we just went back to, you know, when did we first meet and what were different things that were coming together, like what were the things we wanted to do. And Pride was, doing a Pride parade was one of those things. And Rukhsana will also highlight on that we did it online this time, and putting it all together, and other events as well. And I think one of the things that we've given each other support is to look at what the government and other international organizations have just sort of furthered their agenda. Like they keep working on getting, you know, different documents out that are very, very dangerous, using very violent languages, and set a really dangerous precedents, even though, you know, to the world, the Constitution of Nepal looks in paper, you know, sort of like good and safe for the queer community at large. But in reality, it is not so. I think in our own group, we've struggled with, you know, not being able to access education because of our paperwork, right? Not being able to, like financial difficulties because of COVID. So these are things that we've struggled with as we come from like different backgrounds as well. So anything else, I think I'll hand it over to Rukhsana. Thank you.
Hi, this is Rukhsana. I'm quite very messed up. Raji has already given quite a background about sort of what, like, you know, the queer feminist organizing during the pandemic was. It's actually exciting because a lot of things that happened during the pandemic was quite very historic in terms of Nepal, like in context of Nepal, because it was happening for the first time. We released around 4 different charter of demands that was all online. So the first one started with National Transgender Demand Sheet. This was the first ever gathering, or the first ever sort of discussion that took place and gave a tangible output that was in regards to binary transgender people, trans men and trans women in particular. And it was so much coming from the fact that trans people are obliged, forced, or legally compelled to choose a third gender marker. And due to that context, because a lot of things, like, you know, a lot of international media really glorify Nepal for being transgender friendly country, which is so wrong, and they completely ignore the lived experiences of people living in Nepal. We came out with the National Transgender Demand Sheet on International Transgender Day of Visibility, 31st March, which was groundbreaking in its term, that it was the first ever charter of demands that came from a binary trans perspective. And because also in Nepali language, there was lack of vocabulary for the term transgender, and the term transgender and third gender were very interchangeably used. And trans people, young trans people came out with the term called paralaingik. in Nepali language, which also gave a space for us to sort of, like talk about trans issues without like conflating it with a third gender identity. We also the same year, during the pandemic on May 17, we did a lot of reach out through social media, through internet, and came out with National Charter of Demands on Legal Recognition of Gender Identity, which include a very wide range of issues from trans people, also third gender people, gender diverse people, non-binary people, and intersex people, and also people who wanted to opt out, taking a gender marker, and sort of included a lot of different components on language, on privacy, and on a lot of other different things. And also we challenged the current law that is forcing not just transgender people, but there is a law that says LGBTI is a third gender. We challenged that law, and we said that sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristics need to be properly understood in the legal jurisdiction, and they should not be conflated, and blah blah. A lot of different things. We also came out because a lot of things happened with the citizenship bill. The parliament was really pushing the bill, amending the Citizenship Act, and the tabled bill and the one that and the report that got passed through a committee, it really addresses the rights of transgender people, because it also very much limits gender identity to a third gender option, and then also pathologizes and makes a medical requirement for this. And we also made a charter of demands on, and we did a lot of campaigns that was online about this. Also, particularly, we also had recently on October 26th, we had a national intersex demand sheet, which was also about gender identity. So assuming that just because someone is born with intersex characteristics does not mean they are by default third gender. Again, the issue with third gender thing. So these are some of the charter of demands that we came out with this year, and it was all during the pandemic, and the connection was already we were building connections before the pandemic, and most of the things that was happening online, so it was also easy for us to roll up during although the pandemic was going on, but also a lot of things really became saturated online, and it was quite a lot of things were actually happening online, and a lot of there was a lot of trolling, and there was a lot of things that actually took place, such as there was this Nepali recreation of the Danish Girl movie, and there was a lot of misgendering happening around that. And also very recently, the news media, the news coverage about Sarah McBride, who was elected in the Senate of a state in the US. She was also very much widely misgendered by Nepali media. So we were also doing press statements and sending it to the different presses and press council, Ministry of Communications, and also the US Embassy, and sort of these kinds of things were happening around. Also, the second Pride Parade. So we started organizing a separate Pride Parade. Pride Parade prior to 2019 was celebrated on a festival, and that festival was particular to related with death. So if someone dies in your family, then you dress up like a clown, or you just if you dress up as someone funny, you dress up like a cow, typically called in our language, and you parade it around. So Pride Parade was actually done on that occasion, and last year we started a separate Pride Parade of our own, which sort of so this year it was the second Pride Parade, and due to the pandemic did not let it go. We didn't let it go, and we did it online. We did it on Twitter. We did various Zoom sessions about mental health, and it was from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. and a lot of different things were going on. So yeah, a lot of things that were actually even in the pandemic happening around activism, around queer feminist movement, and a lot of things that I told right now. I can share those resources in the chat box, and people can also connect to me if you want more resources about activism in Nepal and stuff like that. So to be short, I wish I didn't. I hope I didn't take a long time. So yeah, I would like to end this.
I
Thank
also wanted to add just about the way we, I think, going back to the question of the like queer feminist like praxis, I felt that the way we planned on the back end, which was really slow and taking everyone's sort of taking everyone's views in consideration and making sure that it can be as safe as possible. Like we did get hacked by trolls, and we had to get out of the room and create another room during the day, which we thankfully we had planned for it. We had a plan, but when it happened, it was still really scary. I think our hashtag got like was trending on Twitter, so it seemed like there were these Russian like trolls, like white cis men coming in and like taking, they sort of hacked into the main like host, and then they were like showing pornographic videos, and so it was really scary for a bit, but we'd had planned if that were to happen, so we were able to like shift pretty quickly. And as a result, as like the whole day after doing the pride parade whole day, at the end of it, we also have another chat group with the participant who came on there. So that has also been a big support for folks connecting over the pandemic. Like it has around 35 or so individuals from all over Nepal, like mostly urban areas. So that's also been a really wonderful resource of connection. And every time we've created chat groups, we've always had a code of conduct, like ethics about what is okay to do and not to do, so that we are figuring out how to make the space as safe as possible. There's a lot of really awful, violent trolling of young queer youth happening in Nepal, and that remains to be something that is of a high concern for our group. And we're a lot of the work we're looking to do, I mean, right now also is trying to figure out how to sort of, be there and support each other more, because that's happening a lot online, and we're also hearing a lot of these dismissive remarks from people saying like, oh, don't use online resources, if you're getting trolled. But that's easier said than done, because often for queer individuals and, femme bodies, and it's one of those places where we create connections, right? So it's a mixed bag. Like we want to take up space, right? So that's one of the things that I think we're like connecting on and struggling and figuring out how to keep ourselves safe. Thank you so much.
I'm going to go straight on to Nandini now. I want to ask you to introduce your work and your background, but also I want to ask you to reflect on the question of how disability studies and queer feminist traversals and solidarities might work together to develop kind of mutual critiques of the marginalizing effects of the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you, Paul, Rohit and Niharika, for inviting me to this panel and for inviting me to contribute to the volume. I think it was also the journey between activism and academia is a shifting one. So I began my career as an activist. I was working as a disability activist for quite some time, and then I shifted to academia. And then you find that it is not too difficult to straddle both the worlds at the same time, because your research feeds into your practice, and your practice then feeds into your research. So that this bridge is always there, though we tend to think that these are two very separate worlds. So as of now, I am, as I was thinking about how to introduce myself, I realized that I have been, for the last 24 years, working on disability issues, researching disability for the last 15 years now, nearly 20 years now. And at present, I am assistant professor at the Institute of Development Studies, Kolkata. which is primarily a research institute where we do all kinds of research, and my core areas are basically, as I have already mentioned, disability, but I also look at gender and other marginalities, which include caste and religion to a certain extent. So basically, if I also have to talk about my work, when Niharika and I first spoke about this project, basically, I have what we were looking at really is the lived experiences of disabled people during the pandemic situation. And these lived experiences were, some of them were part of my own experiences, as I was also part of a larger COVID crisis support network for disabled people in West Bengal. And we were realizing how difficult it was for people. Food was one major area, but it was also very, very difficult for people to access medical support, medicines, caregiver support, and also support for transport for, say, to hospitals when there was a crisis situation. There was also these situations where families that had contracted COVID, families of disabled people, and they were in these helpless situations of not finding an alternative care system or a support system where the disabled person, the child could be accommodated within this urban setup, which is a very, very it's a setup where the relationships, the bonding are not as strong as they are probably in the rural areas. So this was what a lot of people were struggling with. And then what you find, what is emerging through the narrative of the COVID-19 crisis is the fact that not only do disabled people get left out of the larger parameters of, say, so-called relief that was being distributed, but it is also the fact that the issues around touch, the issues around contamination, contagion, the issues around even social distancing for disabled people were very large issues to a certain extent. And if you look at the entire gamut of disabilities, you will find that very specific disability-centered issues are there in terms of touch and contamination. And there was also the financial burden that had to be negotiated, which was not forthcoming by anyone at any sector of the state that was responding to this kind of issues. The other set was the more what the larger society was experiencing in terms of the psychosocial stresses, the mental health concerns that were there for the larger population. But for certain disabilities like intellectual impairments, for psychosocial disabilities, social distancing, hygiene practices, etc., were quite daunting. So this kind of a scenario also laid bare the fact that the state has been absent in terms of care and protection for the most vulnerable populations in India, out of which the disabled are a very large group. Now, in the urban areas, what really happens is the family has always been the primary site of care and protection. And what is increasingly happening is that the elderly are providing the bulk of the care for disabled people. And what this did actually during the pandemic and the lockdown is the fear of contagion, the concern about money, access to medical facilities, etc., led to a lot of stress, and this got expressed. And there are these particular cases that happened in Kolkata itself, where I live. This elderly father who strangulated his middle-aged, unemployed, disabled son because he refused to wear a mask outside the house. So that the state did not take any responsibility, the community did not take any responsibility, and this is the gap through which these people fell through. The other issue is mostly about what is something that is not talked about in India, the stress of the caregivers themselves. One was what I have already talked about, but the fact that there was a lot of aggressive behavior by disabled people themselves towards their families and their caregivers. Now, this is a very novel scenario because disabled people are always talked about as a dependent disabled person, and the abusive person with disability is something which is a non-concept at all. It is nothing that cannot be conceptualized. So this is something that has also emerged during this kind of a stressful situation. The other point that I would also like to stress here is the fact that because disabled people are conceived as being dispensable, not contributing to families, the pandemic was also used to dispose of persons with disabilities who are looked down as dependent. And there are these cases across India that were reported. A young girl in Jaipur was sexually abused and murdered by her brother at the behest of the parents. In Kolkata, a young man with psychosocial disability was hacked to death by his younger brother with the consent of the parents. So these kind of violence and aggression that was seen against disabled people and also by disabled people. And so what really I really would like to stress what happened during the pandemic in terms of disabled people, their families in the urban context is that this whole disability, aggression, violence, etc., it also unsettled these dominant patriarchal and ableist ideologies. And there was a lot of issues that have come to the forefront. These conflicting issues of care, violence, and disability, which are concealed within the dominant discourses in society, and the state which remains oblivious to this kind of a scenario. Now, responding to the question that you asked me really, and that is something where if we are talking about building bridges between academia and the activists, we are also here talking about necessarily building bridges between different sorts of movement or different kinds of activists and their and the work that they do. So basically, if I really would like to very quickly sum up, I would really say that we need to talk about building some kind of a coalitional relationships between disability, critical disability studies and queer feminist transversal studies, because that is where I think we can start looking at what Joan Scott really talked about as collective affinity, where we are really describing identities as a complex set of features which are attributed to individuals that pathologize and oppress. So basically, in terms of looking at this kind of a collective affinity between different groups and bringing them to the same platform in terms of this affinity that is there, and the solidarity that can be built through central values of diversity and difference. And this has to be acknowledged and respected, but not negated when we are trying to build a coalition between these different marginalized groups. And the coalition would probably give strength to the ways in which these groups react to one another. Now, the other point that I would like to stress here is the fact that how these two movements can speak to each other is in terms of the resistance and is in terms of justice. So basically what I would like to again talk about is building of a futuristic look of what society should be like. So solidarities that could emerge out of this specific pandemic situation can actually try to address and transform the oppression of negative identities. And so we can then look towards a future that is accessible to all, and where diversity, difference, respect, acceptance, these are things that become key to dignified everyday lives. And I stop here, and maybe I can respond later. Thank you.
Thank you, Nandini. Yeah, we will have some time for some more questions later, but I mean, we really appreciate that you pulled a lot of really complex issues together there, especially around care, violence and disability, how the most marginal become even more marginal in the context of an epidemic, but also all the affinities that we can draw on together and explore. And that's an important part of our project. And hopefully we'll have some more questions about the nature of those possible affinities in our discussion. So next I want to ask Dhiren to introduce themselves, say something about their chapter and their wider work, but also if they can also explore the question of how queer feminist lenses can learn from the experiences of class, caste, and citizenship in the time of the pandemic.
Thank you so much, Paul, Niharika, and Rohit for inviting me over in this panel and also graciously accepting our chapter as part of the volume that you are editing. I am Dhiren Borisa. I am a Dalit queer person, currently in Delhi, assistant professor at Jindal Global Law School, also an honorary visiting fellow at University of Leicester. The current chapter that we have submitted for this volume is co-authored with Professor Gavin Brown from University of Leicester, and it builds on and draws from research that we have been collectively doing. Niharika is also part of it, the larger project with Leicester Institute of Advanced Studies, where we are thinking about what does it mean to be a citizen during pandemic times. And the chapter actually draws from very intimate, personal landscape of my life. What all happened and what all you lost during pandemic. The two of my housemates and friends, I'm a part of a queer commune where picked up and incarcerated. It has been more than 170 days now that they are still in prison, but that's largely contextualized within the very idea of citizenship. That the battlefield, that what pandemic has allowed the state government to do is to pick up bodies that do not fit into the national imagination, the conducive imagination of its nationhood. So it would be to draw the boundaries of good citizen, bad citizen, and ambiguous citizenships, but to simultaneously put especially Dalit Muslim bodies as bodies that do not reflect the larger imagination of the Hindu fascist government. So the context within which the chapter opens up is a conversation on a digital dating app where you're talking with somebody, some random stranger trying to hook up, but what all conversations and affinity can be built on a dating app. And it starts with this very protest that was risen against the Citizenship Amendment Act, the National Register of Citizenship, which was widely contested by Muslim minority communities when Muslim women stepped out of the houses, protested for the gross human rights violations, the ways in which the government was trying to erase the citizenship rights of certain bodies. And this particular conversation that I'm having with this person on this dating app reflected this very anxiety that both of us were facing, because both our friends were being lifted up, picked up, and incarcerated for the pretext of being protesting against the Citizenship Act. That what we were understanding during this time, especially with migrants moving from cities back to their home and dying on the roads with nobody caring about them, where in a context where Kashmir has been under lockdown for I don't know when, in a context where the sentiment of Hindu nationalism stemming from since 1990s, the temple will be built here, mandir yahi banayenge, gets fruitioned in the laying down of the temple's foundation stone in Ayodhya. And all of this is happening to suggest that what kind of bodies cannot necessarily fit into the national imagination. And that's something that probably our chapter tries to build in, tries to bring in, that what pandemic allowed states to do was to use it as an excuse to not just treat certain kinds of bodies which are vulnerable and historically marginalized to be seen as vectors or contagion of the virus, but to see them as virus itself, virus to the larger imagination of the state that it wants to build. And that's where we try to locate that how with the sentiments of Corona jihad or incarceration of both Muslim activists and activists who supported those protests, but including arrests which continue to be happening after Bhima Koregaon, an incident that happened 2 years back, and how activists are still incarcerated, to look at lockdown and the incarceral meaning of lockdown to suggest what does lockdown, social distancing means for people who have always had disenfranchised lives. For the question, the second question that you asked in context of what does caste, class, and citizenship mean in terms of queer feminist lens in the times of pandemic, and it's strange enough because I feel that queer feminist lens has always been conscious about caste and class and citizenship. The only difference is the caste, class, citizenship that it has been conscious about has been the dominant caste sentiment or dominant class, upper class, middle class queerness, and also the citizenship that builded on respectability. And therefore, in that sense, what queer feminist lens historically, the way it has presented itself, has found a vision, a voice in different spaces, in the way in which it represents itself in the larger global arena, often tends to erase and builds on the presence of caste, class only with the with occasional presences of Dalit, Bahujan, Muslim, Adivasi voices coming into the fray and speaking out. To realize and acknowledge that it has always been a caste consciousness, but caste conscious of a dominant caste narrative of respectable politics is where we should actually begin our conversation about what queer feminist lens can learn from caste, class, rather than building or restricting ourselves to just these abstract categories and not the material constraints and contexts within which the lived realities are being framed for majority of the people. So be it disability rights, be it talking about trans people, you cannot think about queerness and sexuality and negotiations during pandemic if you are not thinking about Grace Bano and how she is building networks in Tamil Nadu and Thoothukudi while fighting against Sterlite factory, but also looking into how to bring together trans community from the Dalit backgrounds. To think about caste and class then is to not just invite Dalit people or Adivasi people into the narratives of queerness, but to understand the very foundation of understanding sexuality and queerness is insufficient if you're claiming it to be from South Asia, if it does not take into consideration how it has always talked about caste. But it's only now that it is now responding to a particular kind of caste as a framework of analysis and not just caste as ingredients of the recipe. So rather than treating working class queer narratives as stories that feed into theories, what does the Dalit queer lives itself mean to the very analysis of the way in which we look at queerness? Because queerness will not be able to be understood if you're not looking at it from the angles of caste, because we have always looked at it from caste.
Thanks, Stu. And that's a really important point about sort of the ontologies of queerness and caste. And anyway, all those queer discussions already always encoded caste and other differences anyway, even if they weren't explicitly talked about. So I think that's really an important point you've made. Also, the point around how certain citizens become conflated with the virus, and how virality becomes also a marker of bad citizenship or the errant body, which I think is also an important kind of collective kind of queer viral memory and legacy. And I'm going to hand over, I think, now to Rohit, who's going to introduce our next speaker, right?
Yeah, thanks, Paul, and thanks, Dhiren. You know, as you were saying, I was also thinking a lot about the role of the press and broadcasting industry, you know, who've been kind of key witnesses to this crisis, but they're also they're political actors in their own right because of the way in which this is all of it's being framed. I mean, a lot of what you've said really has given me food for thought. I want to introduce the next two speakers, which is Koel and Kolika. So if you want to introduce yourselves, and then if you could also, you know, I've got a small question for you, and I was hoping you can also respond to that. You know, how do attempts to live and support during a pandemic add to our understanding of a queer feminist scholarship? So over to you, Kolika and Koel.
Okay, hello everybody, good evening. My name is Kolika. I am currently based in Calcutta and I'm working as a researcher in an organization called Sappho for Equality. It works for the rights of lesbians, bisexual women and transmasculine individuals. So first of all, big thank you to Niharika, Banerjee, Rohit and Paul Boyce for giving us the scope to write about our experiences during the pandemic and giving a platform to queer individuals. So I will briefly give an overview of my write-up in the book. So I live with my grandmom in our house in Kolkata. For me, the pandemic began like it did for many of us when we were slowly trying to understand the implications, the intensity of the tumultuous mess and the trouble that we were in, the days of solitude and the moments of anxieties. Video calls, Zoom meets, late night virtual Uno, these were what most of us were clinging on to with our families, lovers, and friends to keep connected amidst times of a collective paranoia. However, the pandemic hit me hard when we had a sudden medical emergency at home during peak lockdown, when my grandmom had a stroke and was paralyzed. What I was reading about in the newspapers, seeing on television, became a reality for me as well. The night when it happened, and I faced refusal from hospitals, there was shortage of ambulance, lack of doctors, and all of this happening amidst severe restriction on movements. Nothing was normal around us. So, among others, my friends from the queer community offered support and care. My queer friends, for whom my problem somehow became a cause of concern for them as well. So, I think for those whose queer identity is an everyday, living, thriving identity, this constant offer to help and comfort stem from a veiled fear that the other person's call for help may one day become mine. I realized that people have hope from each other, they derive strength from each other. The hundreds of distress calls and the unending hours that people in the community spend just giving hope, comfort, nurturing the will to survive, making them dream of the possibilities of a better life, all these started making sense to me, actually. The queer community faced and continues to face innumerable kinds of crises during the pandemic, crisis in employment, jobs, offices shutting down, and there were so many calls asking for help. It was like a tsunami of distress calls from everywhere. It was almost overwhelming. Everyone was trying to stay afloat. Mental and physical health were at stake. Uncertainties were rising. Hopes were breaking. Everyone was trying to survive, some by attaching and some by detaching. Sappho started giving out ration every month to 60 individuals from across West Bengal, rents to people when required, money for medicines. And we worked with a very limited budget. What I kept telling myself all through was that I was lucky to not be stuck in an abusive home during lockdown. I had the privilege to live, love, dress, eat, sing, laugh, and cry in my own space without anyone imposing restrictions. We kept hearing stories of forced marriages, abuse inside the house, of queer individuals being forced to wear certain clothes inside their homes, restriction on communications. Abusive homes are suffocating and terrorizing during normal, non pandemic, non lockdown times. I actually shudder to think what they transformed into for these queer individuals during this pandemic and what happened to those living in them every moment, every day for all these months. I keep thinking of who survived and who did not. Pandemic and lockdown changed the ways we looked at so many things. We found, we lost, and yet we continuously struggle to be in our best selves possible and survive as queer individuals in this heteronormative world. Now, coming to the question that was asked about the attempts to live in support during a pandemic and how it adds to an understanding of queer feminist kinship. The pandemic was a sudden reality in our lives. It was grasping at our throats. It was forcing us to live with it, with no choice to really escape it or the circumstances that got built around it. None of us were prepared for what it would actually bring for the queer community and also personally in my queer life. I think I understood what a community really meant over the period of lockdown and all the crises associated with it. Even though I have been queer my whole life, for a very, very long time, I had not been part of a collective or even given thoughts to what the community consisted of, what really happened there, and what it really meant. Walking in pride marches, attending queer parties and LGBT film festivals, distributing awareness pamphlets, and all my activities and associations with queer groups across the country, specifically in Hyderabad, Delhi, and Kolkata, they look like one aspect. But what unfurled upon us, upon me during the lockdown, were quite unforeseeable and inestimable. My feeling of kinship with an entire community began with the endless calls of distress from across West Bengal. We came together as a team. We tried to reach out to as many individuals calling for help. Situations range from people becoming homeless, jobless, foodless, their physical and mental health collapsing, and all of this happening only and only because of their non heteronormative gender sexual identities and expressions. People even died, and we couldn't do anything beyond a point. As I have mentioned in the chapter, that the pandemic not just brought fear of an unknown virus, but exposed our deepest vulnerabilities and madly stirred our innate impulse for survival. Everyone called out for help at some point. For some, it was well within time. For some, it was too late. And for some, I need to know yet. I realized even more how this community relies so much more on each other than on state machineries. A long history of violence, invisibilization, refusal to acknowledge, negation, shaming, othering, judging, and abandoning, practiced very profoundly and brutally, has built a connection, a space to seek help, provide help, with a fierce emotion of solidarity and a sense of interdependence. I realized that the expectations from the state and its machineries arise from a sense of pride and determination in one's identity and the consciousness for the need to visualize oneself as an equal citizen of this country and demand food, shelter, employment, and medical help, among others. However, the expectations from the community and the collective arise from shared histories of love, desire, violence, celebrations of life and death. During a time when many backed out, couldn't offer a hand of help, couldn't understand needs, causes of crisis, or help seeking voices, all surely being effects and consequences of the fear of the virus and the imposed lockdown with its restriction on movements. I say this with varying amounts of pride, disappointment, happiness, hurt, and comfort that the queer community steadfastly stood together and attended to those calls from others in the community and provided, or at least took utmost effort to provide relief in whichever form required at that moment. Around me, somebody was always there to attend to those calls of despair and suffering, no matter when. It was made sure that some help was extended. Somehow, everyone worked together, virtually and physically, and created this beautiful network of healing. It was almost astonishing to witness the struggle to survive and make the other survive as well. That's what my queer kinship has been weaved around. It consists of strangers, lovers, friends, and comrades, giving me the desire to fiercely trust the spirit of solidarity and compassion, ideals which are almost crucial to the sustenance of familial and kinship ties across blood and boundaries. Thanks a lot. So now over to Koel.
Hi, my name is Koel Ghosh, and I identify as a gender non-conforming person. My pronouns are they and them. I am the managing trustee of Sappho for Equality. It's a queer feminist organization. And during this pandemic, the only thing that I learned is things about myself and things about the bubble that I'm living in. You know, before the pandemic, I really thought that I have everything that is necessary for a privileged person to sustain, whether it is a home, which I can call my own, whether it is friends who I can call my own, whether it is socioeconomic status that I belong to. But during this pandemic, this was a rude shocker to me because I realized that the natal home, which is supposed to provide care and comfort to a lot of people, I did not have access to that. I did not have access to someone from my natal home to call family who would provide me support and love and care. As a queer individual, I have often felt extremely scared. I've had frequent panic attacks. I've had frequent, claustrophobic attacks. And during this pandemic, this feeling of being stuck in one place, I had to really grapple with it. I realized that this social distancing and this safe at home is a facade that not everybody can afford, because so many people from the community were thrown out of their natal homes, and they had to survive in rented spaces, which were extremely problematic. They were violated every day, in and day out. We got frantic calls from in our helpline from all over the country, people crying out about the kind of violence that were meted out to them from their natal families, whether it was coercion of marriage, they were forced to get married to the people of the other gender. So we realized that this social distancing, this staying safe at home is not something that is going to work for us. We realized that we need to somehow connect with these people. So we intervened in a lot of crisis intervention situations, and we ensured that some of the marriages could be stopped. We ensured that 61 people from the transmasculine, lesbian, and bisexual community was provided with ration and financial assistance. We made sure that their rents were paid for. We made sure that we reached out to them and told them that we are here, don't worry, we are going to help you through this. We realized that this help that we were providing, this reaching out was not enough, because there are so many people that we could not reach out to because of because of the distance, because of transport not working. And there was this sense of helplessness. There was calls that were coming at 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock at night, and our helpline was it was open for 24/7. And I had to deal with calls about people who are about to commit suicide, and they were just holding on to that one thread of hope. And I gave in my 100% to give them that sense of comfort. I don't know, some of them did call me back telling me that they did survive that night, but some calls I never got. So I still don't know what really happened, because after a point of time, the helplessness of it all was so overwhelming. We had this person who was a previous member of Sappho for Equality, has not been in touch with us for so long, and this person lost out on their job. The person used to do tuitions, and the person lost out on their job, and just refused to eat from the 24th of September till the 1st of November, which is when we got in touch with them, and we were informed about that in our social media handle, and we reached out to them. We uh, it was a situation where the family, the brother lives just right beside their house, but did not find out what had happened to this person. And when we reached, it was too late. We tried to take them to the hospital. We did that. We provided them with the necessary support that was required. We ensured that the correct genders were used, the correct pronouns were used. We made sure that the person was admitted to a male ward, but it was too less, I think, because within 4 days they died. And the sheer helplessness of it all, the sheer helplessness to see someone die in front of you, someone you could have saved if you had known a little earlier, someone who could have lived a little more, was so heartbreaking, to say the least. It was so heartbreaking to know that you could not do what you could have if you had known a little earlier. There were moments of utter despair. There were moments of utter hopelessness. There were moments of utter helplessness that we had gone through. And I think the only comfort, the only solace that I got was from my queer community, my queer kins, who reached out to me, who stood by me, who stood by us, and together we tried to make our lives a little more livable. I know that these are the privileges that some of us have, to have a collective to fall back on, to have a collective to hold on and cry is also a privilege that not all of us have, and this has actually been an eye-opening situation for me, because I know now that you will have to make more mechanisms to reach out, more mechanisms to tell people that you're right there, and there's just hope at the other side of the tunnel. This pandemic has shown us that what is the worst that can happen. This pandemic has shown us how people give up on themselves. This pandemic has shown us how people choose to die instead of live. Sometimes it's forced upon us. And the sheer disdain and indifference of the state machinery, the sheer, it fills our heart with so much anger and so much rage that actually we could only reach out to 60, 70, 80, 100 people. But there are so many people outside this purview who could not be reached out, but could have been if the state was a little more functional, who could have been, saved if our government was working the way they should have. And it didn't, you know. There was so much, there were so many people who actually became friends in this process. Every month when we go and give them ration, it's not just the food and the medical essentials that we give them. We give them that understanding and that reassurance that we are here, and till we can, we will be able to provide them with whatever they need so that they are ready to get back to their, get back to their jobs. And it's such a sad situation, but then there is some hope which I think collectives provide. There is some love, some comfort to know that you're not going to die unattended, to know that there is somebody who's looking out for you. There are some calls that come even after a really bad, hard day, and this is something that I have learned. This is what I have learned about kinship during this time. This is something that has reinstated my faith that I or people like me are not alone. So yeah, so that is what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Koel and Kolika. That it was quite hard listening to some of those, but I think the points that you've also made about queer kinship and queer friendship is really, really important, and the role that collectives play. I mean, having known Sappho for so many years, I know what stellar work you all do. But yeah, I don't think I've got anything more to say. But thank you so much for sharing those. They were very heartbreaking to hear. I want to next call on Debjyoti, who's going to be our next speaker. And Debjyoti, if you want to introduce yourself and then yeah, give us your opening remarks. And I also have a question for you. I think especially given your perspective of being a migrant, being actually outside India, being in South Africa right now, how does a queer feminist perspective add to our understanding of migration during the times of pandemic? Thanks.
Hi, firstly, thank you, Niharika, Rohit, Paul, for accepting my chapter and organizing this. I think bringing us together really helps in making us understand how we are all forming the different threads, the fabric of the book, and it's been quite a humbling experience to listen to some of, we all know what kind of privileges some of us have over here, right? Like the stability, the securities and all. Anyway, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Debjyoti Ghosh, an Indian human rights lawyer, originally from Calcutta. I'm currently based in Johannesburg in South Africa. And while practicing in India, I worked in the field of HIV and sexual and gender minorities at the ground level. I've been involved with the LGBT movement in India and carry on doing so remotely. Currently, I'm doing a postdoc at the Department of Sociology at the University of Pretoria, where I'm looking into what I broadly term political citizenship. So I got to South Africa from India the day the Indian government started curtailing international flights. I had to get back to my home because I was already based in Johannesburg at that time, and I had gone back to India to get a visa renewal done. My husband was based here, and this is also my safe space. And I wanted to get back primarily because none of us had any idea when the restrictions would start getting raised, and the restrictions were coming in on a daily basis. And once back in South Africa, my self-isolation started, and then lockdown was enforced here too by the end of March. In a few weeks from then, the entire migrant labor movement in India started unfolding. The heavy hand that it was dealt with and the poverty porn that ensued before they could jump on the topic of the suicide of a Bollywood star was enough to send anyone spiraling into absolute despair about their country. So my chapter, Queer in Transit, is a semi-autoethnographic write-up about my own experiences during this period. It's kind of an account of my own interaction with travel during the time of COVID, quarantining, queer displacement, queer uncertainties, queer isolation, international and domestic legal regulations that regulate the movement of queer bodies, and accounts of other people who identify as queer and facing extreme uncertainty, being rendered jobless, homeless, and rootless. Through the chapter, I'm thinking of the navigation of different social realities, the precarity of queer family, the anxieties of life and death in the time of COVID-19, queer loneliness, risky behavior induced by anxiety and loneliness, and legal frameworks that guide and demarcate all of this, and what might lead to queer erasure. In the chapter, I refer not just to my experiences, but also to the experiences of other people shared with me over this period, when they reached out for support of all sorts, legal, financial, and above all, emotional. Somewhere through the chapter, I try and express my frustration in not being able to do enough, a certain sense of guilt of being better placed than many other people, and anger at existing structures that make queer lives more difficult in particular jurisdictions. So going towards the question Rohit just asked me, what does a queer feminist perspective add to our understanding of migration during a pandemic? My answer also looks in part at queer migration. So the COVID-19 pandemic, as we all know, has posed a health threat and affected the functioning of almost all social systems, both within and outside national borders. So preventing the further transmission of the pandemic has particularly affected the spatial mobility of the population and migration. Restrictions on cross-border movement and travel and the introduction of quarantine measures have abruptly halted not only international, but also migration within the borders of nation states. Now, two aspects come up over here around mobility. One that has become abundantly clear is the immobility surrounding the elderly and the infirm, and all those who got stuck in places far away from their homes, their families, and their loved ones. And secondly, the mobility enforced on people who have needed to be repatriated to their countries of origin, or who have managed to expatriate themselves either just before the lockdown or right after hard lockdown ended in their countries to join their families, friends, etc. So I'm one of those who fits in the latter category. Now, queer feminism in general helps us understand the plight of those people who are awkwardly placed within existing categories. Without having a queer feminist lens, it is not possible to engage and interrogate the intersectional inequalities that emerge in these situations. During a pandemic, some inequalities that have become more apparent than others are financial security, food security, physical movement. Everything becomes predicated on social placement. Queer women and trans and gender non-conforming people are among those who are frequently left out of the discussion of mainstream feminism. So are people of color, people with disabilities, sex workers, migrant workers, people who are undocumented. The experiences and those of many others are frequently not addressed. In general, queer feminist perspectives in migration help to understand the plight of migrants in both the global north and south. Looking specifically at queer migration, queer migrants often move away from the heteronormative conditions of just seeking better economic conditions to seek a place with more freedoms than where the migrant hails from. So the holy grail over here is a safer place. Freedom to be able to express oneself takes precedence there. The notion of a safer space starts translating differently during a pandemic because for one, the person is trying to stay physically uninfected, and for another, given the lockdowns we have already gone through in many parts of the world, the person is trying to be in an emotionally safe space. While queer feminist perspectives have been used to understand the migration during the AIDS pandemic of the 80s, one aspect that the current pandemic doesn't have its immediate connection is with queer people. Yet for obvious reasons, several queer people, especially those who identify as non-binary, genderqueer, etc., have felt the pressures of the pandemic far more acutely. Queer loneliness, queer precarity, the disintegration of queer relationships and community spaces are yet to be focused on. So I will close my answer with a particular queer asylum case that had come up a couple of decades back, or perhaps a little more in the US. It's in Re Tenorio. Juana Rodriguez had done a case analysis on it, and she contended that the need to read queer asylum has to be within the context of the intersection of marginalized, racialized, and class sexualities. Without using queer feminism as a lens to review the situations around us, the reading of everything will be incomplete because they will tend to overlook large intersections of race, poverty, class, caste, religion, gender, which have always, like especially during the period of the pandemic, have placed particular groups in highly vulnerable situations. And like going back to all the discussions we've already heard today, each and every one of the speakers has highlighted certain conditions which are definitely heavily intersectional. If you look at what Dhiren said, if you look at what Kolika and Koel mentioned, what Nandini mentioned, everything comes together over here. So without the queer feminist lens, how can we understand any sort of movement, whether it's cross-border migration or whether it's just, moving from one locale to another? I will close here, and I think I timed myself. I think I'm more or less in time. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Devjyoti. Niharika, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Devjyoti, and thank you, for talking about migration. We are, trying to now, since we are getting a little over time, we are going to have our two last questions and then open it up for questions from those who are still listening in. So I know many people have left. Thank you to those of you who are still here. But also we are having a conversation with each other. So I think that's also important. So Adnan, if I can, Adnan, are you still there?
Yes, I'm here. Actually.
Yes. So Adnan, if I can go back to you, because we started with this, breaking the rounds up, and then we clubbed it together because of time.
Okay.
So I would like to go back to you and ask you the question, in what ways are Hijra life worlds intertwined with viral histories in the global South? If this is something that you can talk about a little bit, that would be useful.
Thank you, Niharika, for the question. I think it's a very important question, and I will share my reflections. So basically, when the lockdown started in mid-March or in early April, when sort of social life suspended, then there was this interesting phenomenon that a group of Hijras sort of appeared as volunteers to be providing the services, right? So, and so I just wanted to kind of reflect on the way this event was dealt with in the media and the civil society. So that some Hijras volunteered to be on the front line and were ready to risk contracting COVID-19, made them visible on social and electronic media since the onset of the corona crisis in Bangladesh. Importantly, that Hijras risked their lives to cater to the needs of the public was seen as an example of heroism, and the media, civil society, and the general public eulogized such deeds. The idea was that as a marginal group located outside the mainstream society, Hijras are worthy of social respect if they're ready to sacrifice their lives. Heroes and encouragement of such chivalry can be seen as a in which the Hijra bodies are deemed as socially disposable and therefore not worthy of grieving over. So the second point I want to make is actually about the protocols of social distancing that were imposed in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis globally, but also within Bangladesh. So in a way, these protocols of social distancing rules, are widely emphasized in public health discourses globally to contain the spread of the coronavirus, are part of the everyday living experience of Hijras who are socially seen as a source of pollution, defilement, and contagion, and are therefore kept at bay by the mainstream society. So the pervasive fear of being in proximity with people that has now become the hallmark of new social interaction in the wake of COVID-19 has been part of the daily experience of Hijras navigating an extremely hostile social world. And as the corona crisis unfolded, I was engaged and involved actually in a fundraising campaign along with two other Hijra and trans-identified colleagues and friends. And while crafting the statement for the fundraising campaign, I sought the advice of a few friends experienced in fundraising. So one piece of advice I received was to delete any reference to Hijras involved, since the idea was that an initiative to help sex workers would likely be seen as insalubrious and unworthy of support by many donors. Now, while I do not mean to, maybe in relation to the middle and the upper classes this argument I would make, particularly the Bangladeshi ones. So while I do not mean to discount the efforts, perhaps of many middle and upper class Bangladeshis who may have supported various other Hijra-focused fundraising initiatives, it is important to emphasize that the dominant middle and the upper classes imagine the Hijras to be dirty, shameless, foul-smelling, and violent, right? So this is the dominant ways they are constructed at a discursive level and also at the level of representation. And also relatedly, an idea that gained traction among the middle classes during the pandemic, both within Bangladesh and also among the Bangladeshi upper middle class diaspora abroad, is that the working class bodies, especially those of the house help, garments workers, and Hijras, are the carriers of the coronavirus. And in an ongoing research project on the impact of coronavirus on the Hijras in Bangladesh that I am currently involved in, narratives with Hijra interviewees are indicating that Hijras were bullied while standing in queues to seek relief, as the non-Hijra populace sort of deemed the Hijras to be carrying the virus and infecting the rest of the society. So the last point that I want to make is basically the way the ongoing situation is reminiscent of the way Hijras were seen during the HIV and AIDS crisis and activism that happened from the late 90s in Bangladesh. So for those unfamiliar with the context, many Hijras worked as peer educators to raise awareness about STD and HIV and AIDS. So this engagement led to social and discursive contestation about the conventional conceptualization of Hijras as being asexual and above desire. So it sort of singled them out as an at-risk community. So while the stigma of being seen as vectors of sexual disease, especially HIV and AIDS, may have tapered off, partially, I would argue. I think. Now that the HIV/AIDS activism in Bangladesh has sort of stalled, the social perception about Hijra bodies being contagious, dangerous, and polluting is still actually rampant. So I think, yeah, more or less, that's what I will end.
Thank you very much, Adnan, for that. And, we have another actually 14 minutes left in this event. So we'll keep those 14 minutes to ask any questions that we may have of each other or those who have been listening in. There is one question that is there, that is already there from Faith, if I may read that out. And then, the rest of you can ask any question or comment soon after that. So this is what Faith asks. What do you feel is the most important thing or things we have learned through the pandemic that will shape how we can reimagine the future of inclusivity and dignity, especially for groups that are marginalized after the pandemic or as we move forward? So anybody who Faith asks if there is any individual or individuals on the panel who spoke who may want to answer that question.
My sense is that things are going to get worse for the LGBTQI people because it is sharpening inequalities. It's of course a broad generalization, but I don't feel hopeful that we're heading into a better world. This kind of post-COVID, so yeah, I feel quite disappointed, to be honest.
I think with QRC in Kathmandu, most of us, all of us are in Kathmandu, we feel this this scary sense of being further pathologized. I work in mental health, and we talk about mental health a lot in our group because just the essence of sustaining a collective, it is so difficult to keep in touch because so many things come in way, and time is just, it's so that's what we don't have because everyone has to do things. It's such a privilege to have time to converse, right? And to put importance to that and to have a collective that feels that, okay, we need to keep coming together and talking, even when there's when times when there are no crisis happening, which is so few and far between, but to keep in touch, to know what are things that we need from each other, and develop that connection, because family might not be there, in the traditional sense. So these are the connections we're having to make. And I see, like, we're seeing a lot more, like, medical articles that are like pathologizing behaviors and different things, and it is very scary. So one of the things that we are thinking of doing in the weeks to come is to really dig deep into conversing about things that we all of us like need. Like, there are a lot of these modules and things coming and saying like, oh, this is how queer people interact and need like mental health services. So we are thinking about what are the things we need in the collective itself. So making space for that discussion and continuing conversation, that kind of has given us a little bit hope. But as I was saying in my comments, like, we're just we're like in the midst of it right now, with the rates going really like high in Kathmandu. So we're really bracing for it. So every day, like every moment like that, we keep in touch and say, okay, everyone is fine, just feels like that little flicker of hope right now. And of course, making plans for the worst. But yeah, Adnan, like, I feel similarly, but the hope is that, we stay connected for now.
Thanks, Raji and Adnan. Any other questions from the audience over here?
I want to start with the very idea that the language of queerness is also not accessible to everybody. The way in which we are framing our arguments in terms of what is community, who can come as a part of a collective, and there's a historical understanding, especially among the marginalized community, who have never felt welcomed as part of larger collectives that have always been representative of queerness, both in terms of the frameworks through which queerness has come to be assembled in our lives has been very different to the way in which our lives have been lived. For many that I know of, when we were going through this lockdown and pandemic, we're more afraid that they would not survive hunger, but they might survive the virus. So what is more dangerous is something that we need to think through. And how to foreground then the understanding that the queerness that we are speaking about is not a homogeneous form of queerness. There's a heterogeneity to it, that the global north and global south conversations that we often talk about, neither global north is homogeneous, neither global south is homogeneous, and that heterogeneity within it will make certain lives more vulnerable and precarious than any. So while we are imagining what lies beyond the pandemic, we need to also understand who is going to be able to survive and see or even imagine what is going to be beyond. To also understand that for many, if I were to say, like, Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi lives are more queer lives than what queerness has come to be established in the mainstream, because those stories are not stories of victimhood, stories of resilience. People have survived through it and survived death. The death might seem, as for queer literature, it might come across during HIV/AIDS epidemic, where death became this viral thing, or now when we are thinking of death during the time of pandemic. For most of the marginalized communities in global south, death has been an everyday. But simultaneously to that has been the courage, the resistance, the resilience to fight and continue living those histories and narrating those histories. And I think that is something that queerness can learn from marginalized communities in that sense. And I'm unfortunately drawing a division between queerness and marginalized communities, because often that is what emerges. And to understand that often when we are trying to collectivize and reach out to people and help people out, we fail to reach and help people out because our collectives have always been gate-kept. Our queerness have always been closed in particular networks. Are we ready to open it up, to reimagine and understand that the way in which pandemic has affected queer lives might not necessarily be in the frameworks that we have always understood queerness to act upon, but ways in which the everydayness of Dalit lives, Bahujan Adivasi lives has actually narrated and lived. So I feel queerness is right now in prisons. Queerness is in the way in which people are dealing with the absence of their loved ones, and which no lawyer is going to represent. The judiciary is not going to do justice to. And these bodies have always suffered, and they will continue to suffer, probably at much greater scale, when state has withdrawn its welfare approach, where it has minimized its commitment towards remedying any of this ill, but actually has shown its full faith and firm belief in that this widening of gaps between these communities is what it will sustain its own agenda of whom it wants to benefit, or what kind of queerness will also be able to thrive and survive. So think about, what do we want to continue? Which queerness are we thinking about? And how to make that more diverse and inclusive in that sense of when we are imagining a queer utopic possibility, a future on the other side of this pandemic, if there is any other side of this pandemic.
Thanks a lot for that, Dhiren. Are there any other questions from the audience to any of our panelists today? If not, there is a question for Shanta. Shanta, are you still with us?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, Shanta, we can hear you. There was a question for you about how do you think queer life worlds are connected with the viral histories of HIV and COVID?
In my experience, it's very worse for people like us who live in the periphery. So, first of all, what we face is like the recent FCRA Act, which is very stringent over the peoples and non-governmental organizations that are working for the community. Because, like even though we are, we have this opportunity to receive funds, then there is a lot of stringence. For example, people have different requirements, and then this, according to this act, they have certain guidelines to follow, and people working in the grassroots, they are not able to fulfill the protocol. So like there were many times that we failed to receive funds from outside the country, and even inside the countries also, because most of my friends from India who wanted to help us, they really were willing to support the people from the Northeast, but actually due to the long processes, the documentation, because like we got frustrated, and then we just drop in the midway. This happens, and this is one man problems in India right now. And the second thing is like, whenever any pandemic or epidemic happen, it is the most marginalized community that are targeted both from the society and from the state also, because like we have been tagged as a viral carrier all the time, and then we fail to address our requirements, our grievances also, because like from the reason we have certain disparity in terms of the level of knowledge, and the language we speak, and the world is very competitive. So like even we wanted to place a proposal to a funder, there is this lack of articulation in English. We do not have this full capacity to write a good proposal because of the language barrier. And then when we talk about inclusion, we also need to rethink and then reimagine the diversity in the queer community, in the queer culture, who is representing the queer queer image, queer identity, queer narratives in the limelight. For example, for India, who represent the trans narratives in the limelight? It is always the majority community. So we need to break down these differences. We should stop playing the tantrum of who is majority and minority, the power that is affiliated with this majority and minority, because I have experienced many times within the queer culture, within the queer community, there is this differentiation, there is this class. Until and unless we stop playing this class, and then like the majority minority power dynamic, then there cannot be inclusion, and then there cannot be union. There cannot be union within the queer community until and unless we understand and recognize the diversity that is existing across the country. So this is what I felt. And then even, for example, for HIV also, when this program comes, the program, the methodology of the program developed based on the Western concept, or else in the, like mainstream idea. So when it comes to the periphery, that it's very difficult for us to accommodate in our tiny world. So this needs to be addressed. Until and unless we address this, then there will be less representation. If there is less representation, there is always this conflict within the queer community, who have been, who have been working together for a common cause. But actually, in reality, no, we are not working for a common cause. We are attempting to fulfill our dream. We are attempting to get our rights only. In this journey, we often left out a huge population of community who have less accessible to the queer resources across the globe, who doesn't have this like capacity to compete with the queer peoples who have a greater exposure, who have a greater connection and network with other larger queer forum. So this need to be addressed, and I think this is very important, because like the voice of queer is very less here. Why the activism is very less? Because like without food we cannot shout, we cannot scream. For this food we need resources, and we have very limited resources. Queer resources is very limited, and those limited resources that's coming for the queer people of the Northeast, it end up somewhere, because the community from the Northeast doesn't have this ability to compete with other queer peoples who are in the higher position, who are in the higher privilege. So we need to address this, and I think this is important.
And Santa, that's really important and helpful. Thank you. And especially for speaking from a marginalized standpoint, both in terms of gender, sexuality, and region from the Northeast. So we're coming to the end of our time. We've slightly overrun, but I think it was so powerful and important to listen to everything that everybody said. It's very moving, sometimes difficult, often enlightening. I think it's been a really great afternoon. I think one of the things that really has opened up in terms of our project is attending to the multiplicities which are encompassed and which are also fail to be encompassed within what we describe as queer and feminist perspectives. Sometimes that can evoke a kind of cosmopolitan, centrist kind of homogeneity, which actually excludes many others in respect of region or caste, class, ethnicity, and disability, and so on. So we really need to pay attention to those fragmentations, which in some ways are very queer, but are often also excluded from the mainstream narrative of queer and feminist perspectivism. And I think there's also this kind of interesting history and fragmentation of resource distribution that Shanta has been pointing to. Where do the monies flow? Who controls access to resources? And we've heard from a number of people about the failures of the state, for example, and the falling back onto the domain of the family as the primary source of care, and how for some that becomes a site of safety and protection, but for many also is another site of failure or excision or rupture or violence. So I think there are many kind of intersecting issues which weave through the narratives that we've heard today, and we'll have to sit back and think together about everything that we've reflected on. And I hand over to Niharika now.
Thank you. I really don't have anything more to add. I have listened and I want to keep on listening. And I think what has been useful for me personally is, you know what, I mean, I always take time. I don't have immediate takeaways. So, I do, I mean, I have a lot of things in my head and in my heart that I will need to think about. And that's what I'm going to do with many of you here who are my co-travelers, co-workers, co-writers, etc. And I look forward to that. So with that, I think I would we would end this session. And thank you again to all of you for being here. So we hope to at some point, I don't know, see each other, some of us at least face to face very soon or virtually. Thank you very much. And if you have any other questions, please, email us. Thank you.